On a Tuesday morning in late October, two Kansas City police officers pulled up in front of a small brick house on the east side of the city and knocked on the door of a 52-year-old black woman named Odessa Grant. Behind them stood a code enforcement officer holding a clipboard and a manila envelope. Inside that envelope was an order giving Odessa 30 days to demolish 9 small dome-shaped homes she had built with her own hands on a vacant lot half a mile away. 11 formerly homeless people were living in those domes. Each one had cost her about $500 to build. But to understand why the city of Kansas City wanted them gone and why Odessa refused to back down, you have to go back to the coldest night of her life. Odessa Grant spent 31 years working in the cafeteria of an elementary school on the east side of Kansas City, Missouri. She got there at 5:30 every morning, before the buses, before the teachers, before the sun in the winter months. She learned the name of every child who came through her line, and she kept a drawer of granola bars for the ones who came to school hungry. She raised 2 kids of her own in a small brick house her parents had bought in 1968, and when her husband passed away from a heart attack at 54, she kept working, kept the house, and kept going the way women like her have always kept going. She also had a younger brother named Curtis. Curtis had been the funny one growing up, the one who could fix any car engine by ear and who taught the neighborhood kids how to ride bikes with no hands. Neighbors used to bring their sputtering Buicks and Oldsmobiles to the curb in front of the Grant house, and Curtis would lean over the engine, listen for a minute, and tell them exactly which part was dying. He never charged anybody more than a cold drink and a conversation, but Curtis came back from 2 tours overseas carrying something heavy that nobody could see, and over the years it took everything from him: the job, the marriage, the apartment. By the time he was in his late 40s, Curtis was sleeping in doorways and under the overpass near Truman Road. Odessa brought him home more times than she could count. She kept a bed made up for him in her spare room with clean sheets and a towel folded on the dresser. He never lasted more than a few nights. He said the walls closed in on him. He said he could breathe better outside. Some winter mornings, she would find him wrapped in blankets on her back porch, because the porch was as far inside as he could stand to be. In January of 2021, during a cold snap that dropped Kansas City to 9 degrees below zero, Curtis Grant lay down behind a shuttered auto parts store on Prospect Avenue and did not wake up. He was 49 years old. He was one of more than a dozen people who died on the streets of that city that winter. Odessa buried her brother on a gray Thursday morning with frost still on the ground, and she came home to her kitchen table and sat there until dark without turning on a single light. Most people carry a grief like that quietly for the rest of their lives. Odessa carried it to the public library. She started going to the branch near her house 3 or 4 afternoons a week after her shift, still in her cafeteria uniform, reading everything she could find about homelessness, about shelters, about why a man like her brother could not survive a system that was supposedly built to catch him. And what she learned made her angry. The shelters were full. The waiting lists for housing assistance stretched past 2 years. A single unit of traditional affordable housing in Missouri cost over $200,000 to build and took years of permits and funding to complete. Do that math the way Odessa did at a library table. $200,000 and years of paperwork for one apartment, while her brother slept behind an auto parts store for free until the cold finished him. The system was not broken. It was just slow. And slow is fatal at 9 below zero. Then one afternoon, a teenage library volunteer helped her look something up on a computer, and Odessa stumbled onto a video of a man in the desert building a small white dome out of something called aircrete. Aircrete is concrete mixed with foam. You blend dish soap and water into a thick shaving cream texture. fold it into a cement slurry in a plastic barrel, and pour it into forms. It cures light enough for one person to lift a block with one hand, but strong enough to build a home that resists fire, wind, mold, and rot. A small dome, about 12 feet across, could be built for a few $100s in materials. It needed no lumber, no nails, and no construction crew. Odessa watched that video 11 times. Then she checked out every book the library had on concrete, printed 40 pages of instructions, and went home to her backyard. She was 50 years old. She had never built anything larger than a birdhouse. Her first batch of aircrete collapsed into gray soup because she mixed the foam wrong. Her second batch cured so brittle it crumbled in her hands like cornbread. She ruined a borrowed drill, burned out a foam generator she had built from a pond pump and a mesh sponge, and spent most of her Christmas savings on cement she had to throw away. She worked through the cold months under a blue tarp strung between her fence and her clothesline, warming the cement bags beside a space heater so the mix would not freeze before it cured. Her neighbors watched over the fence as this cafeteria lady in a church coat and rubber boots stirred barrels of gray foam in the snow, and more than one of them quietly wondered if grief had gotten the better of her. But by the 5th month, Odessa stood in her backyard next to a finished dome. It was 12 feet wide and a little over 9 feet tall at the center, painted a soft cream color, with a round wooden door she had salvaged from a demolition site and sanded by hand. Inside, there was room for a bed, a shelf, a chair, and a small propane heater. She had tracked every receipt in a spiral notebook. The total cost of materials came to $487. She spent one night sleeping inside it in February with the temperature outside at 11 degrees, just to be sure. The dome held its warmth like a thermos. She lay there under a quilt her mother had made and thought about Curtis behind that auto parts store. And she made the same kind of promise her brother's memory seemed to demand. Nobody in her neighborhood was going to freeze to death outside a locked building again. Not if $500 and her own 2 hands could prevent it. Now she needed land. Odessa found it at a county tax auction that spring, a vacant lot on the east side that had been sitting empty for 19 years, choked with waist-high weeds, dumped tires, and a rusted washing machine somebody had abandoned in the middle of it. Nobody else bid. She bought it for $1,400, nearly everything left in her savings account, and she got a deed with her name on it and a piece of Kansas City that was finally hers. The first 2 months on that lot were nothing but cleanup. Odessa hauled out 63 tires. She raked broken glass into buckets until her palms blistered through her gloves. A young man named Darnell from 2 streets over showed up with a lawnmower one Saturday without being asked, and after that, he never really left. Then came a retired brick mason named Mr. Dodson, 71 years old, who had heard about the dome in her backyard from his barber. He looked at her aircrete blocks, tapped them with his knuckle, nodded slowly, and told her he had a few things to teach her about laying a course level. He came back every weekend for a year. The first dome on the lot went up in 6 weeks. The second took 4. By the third, Odessa had a system. Volunteers mixed aircrete in 3 barrels at once while gospel music played from a speaker on a folding table. A church on 27th Street donated doors and windows from a renovation. A concrete supplier on the industrial side of town, run by a man whose own cousin had spent years on the street, started selling her cement at cost and delivering it for free. A high school shop class adopted the project and built the wooden door frames as a semester assignment. A retired nurse started showing up on poor days with a cooler of sandwiches and a first aid kit, and she stitched more than one blistered hand at that folding table. And one Friday, the manager of a hardware store called to say a customer had paid in full for a pallet of roof sealant and refused to leave a name. Each finished dome got insulation, a raised wooden floor, a bed, a heater, a battery lantern, a lock, and a key. And each key went to a person. The first key went to a 63-year-old Army veteran named Ray, who had been sleeping under the Truman Road overpass in the same stretch where Curtis used to sleep. Ray did not believe it was real until Odessa put the key in his hand and told him the dome was his for as long as he needed it. No rent, no curfew, no paperwork. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he asked her if he could plant tomatoes outside it. Ray's tomato plants became the first garden in the village. The second key went to a young mother named Keisha and her 4-year-old daughter, who had been sleeping in an aging Buick behind a laundromat. The third went to an elderly man named Walter, who had lost his apartment when his building sold to a developer, and who wept openly when he saw that his dome had a shelf built at exactly the right height for his late wife's photograph, because Odessa had asked around and found out about the photograph in advance. The fourth key went to a woman everyone came to call Miss Dorothy, who had spent 2 years riding the city bus at night because a moving bus was the only place she felt safe enough to sleep. On her first morning in the village, she swept the gravel path from one end to the other without being asked, and she has swept it every morning since. By month 14, there were 9 cream-colored domes arranged in a gentle half-circle on that once abandoned lot, with a gravel path down the middle, a shared fire pit, raised garden beds, solar lanterns lining the walkway, and a hand-painted sign by the entrance that read, Curtis Village. 11 people lived there. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the lot now dropped off casseroles. Crime on that block, according to residents, went down, not up, because 11 people now watched over a corner that used to belong to nobody. But not everybody was watching that corner with the same eyes. Odessa did not know it yet, and neither did Ray. But somebody a few blocks away had already started making phone calls. If this story is hitting you the way it hit us, take 1 second and hit subscribe. Because every week, we tell stories about ordinary people who built something out of nothing for the ones everybody else gave up on. Now, back to that Tuesday morning in October, because this is where everything Odessa built came under threat. The letter taped to her front door came first, about a week before the officers did. It was from the city's Code Enforcement Division, and it cited an anonymous complaint. The domes, the letter said, were unpermitted structures. The lot was not zoned for residential occupancy. There was no approved sewer connection, no inspected electrical service, no certificate of occupancy for any of the 9 homes. Under the municipal code, the structures were classified as dangerous buildings subject to condemnation. Odessa read the letter 3 times at her kitchen table, the same table where she had sat in the dark after Curtis's funeral. Then she called the number at the bottom and spent 40 minutes being transferred between 4 departments. And by the end of it, the only clear answer she had was that the process was already in motion and there was nothing she could file, sign, or pay to stop it. The following Tuesday, the 2 police officers and the code enforcement officer knocked on her door with the manila envelope. The order inside gave her 30 days. Every dome demolished, every resident removed at her own expense, or the city would clear the lot itself and bill her for the cost. One of the officers, an older man, kept his eyes on the porch floor for most of the conversation. As they turned to leave, he paused and told her quietly that his department had pulled more than a dozen bodies off the street the winter her brother died, and that he was sorry, and that he was only doing his job. Odessa stood on her porch holding that envelope and watched the patrol car pull away. Then she did the thing that changed everything. She did not panic, and she did not hide it. She walked the half-mile to Curtis Village, gathered all 11 residents around the fire pit, read them the entire order out loud, and told them the truth. Keisha held her daughter a little tighter. Miss Dorothy stared into the fire and said nothing. Ray stood up, took his key out of his pocket, closed his fist around it, and said that the last time somebody ordered him out of a position, he was wearing a uniform, and he did not move then either. Then Odessa told them the other truth. She said the city had a process, and processes have public meetings, and public meetings have microphones, and she intended to be standing in front of one. Word moved through the east side the way word has always moved through neighborhoods like that one. From porch to barbershop to church pew to group text. A young woman who had volunteered on Dome Number 6 posted a photograph of Ray standing in front of his tomato plants holding the demolition notice, and within days that photograph had been shared hundreds of thousands of times and was still climbing. A reporter from a local news station came out on a Thursday and filmed a segment inside Walter's dome, with his wife's photograph on the shelf and his reading glasses folded on the bed, and asked the question that ended up on the evening news. If this is a dangerous building, what do we call the sidewalk he was sleeping on before? Donations arrived that Odessa never asked for, so did something more valuable. A structural engineer named David Okafor, who had seen the news segment, drove out to the village, spent 2 full days testing the domes, and produced a signed 22-page report certifying that the aircrete structures exceeded residential safety standards for fire resistance and wind load, and were, in his written words, more durable than half the permitted housing stock in the surrounding zip code. A retired city planner helped Odessa understand the zoning code better than most of the people enforcing it. And a councilwoman named Yvette Chapman, who represented the district and whose own mother had once been evicted with 3 kids, called Odessa personally and told her to bring everyone she knew to the next council meeting. Odessa brought everyone she knew. On a cold Wednesday evening in November, the line outside City Hall started forming an hour before the doors opened. More than 400 people filled the council chamber and spilled into the hallway and down the marble stairs. Cafeteria workers from the school where she had served lunch for 3 decades, the concrete supplier, the retired nurse, Mr. Dodson in his church suit, the high school shop class sitting in the second row with their teacher, and in the front row, all 11 residents of Curtis Village. Ray spoke first. He stood at the microphone in his army jacket, laid his dome key on the podium where everyone could see it, and said that in 63 years, that key was the first thing anyone had ever given him that could not be taken back at a shelter door at 6 a.m. Keisha spoke about her daughter sleeping through the night for the first time in a year. Walter simply held up the photograph of his wife and said that for the first time since she passed, he had a wall to hang her on. Then Odessa walked to the microphone. She did not bring notes. She told the room about a cafeteria drawer full of granola bars, and about a brother who could fix any engine by ear, and about 9 degrees below zero behind an auto parts store on Prospect Avenue. She held up her spiral notebook of receipts and told the council that the city had spent more money processing her demolition order than she had spent housing 11 human beings. And then she said the sentence that ran on every local station the next morning. She said, "You can tear down my domes in 30 days, but you cannot tell me where these 11 people are supposed to sleep on day 31, because you have never had an answer to that question, and I do." The chamber stood up. The demolition order did not survive the month. What happened next took longer because change through a city government always does. But it happened. Councilwoman Chapman introduced a pilot ordinance creating a legal category for micro-home villages on approved land with a streamlined inspection process built around Mr. Okafor's engineering report. A Baptist church 8 blocks from the original lot offered 3 acres it had been holding for decades, which solved the zoning problem overnight, and the city agreed to run water and sewer connections to the property as part of the pilot. The 9 original domes were inspected, certified, and grandfathered in where they stood. Not one was ever torn down. Today, Curtis Village and its sister site on the church land hold 23 domes between them, with 9 more under construction. Ray runs the gardens now and supervises new volunteers with the seriousness of a drill sergeant and the patience of a grandfather. Miss Dorothy still sweeps the gravel path every morning, both paths now, and rides the city bus only when she actually needs to go somewhere. Keisha finished a medical assistant program and moved into an apartment last spring, and when she left, she handed her key back to Odessa so it could go to somebody else, which is exactly how Odessa designed it to work. Walter is still there, still has the photograph on the shelf, and greets every new resident on their first morning with coffee. And Odessa Grant, 54 years old now, still mixes aircrete in a barrel most Saturdays with gospel music playing from the folding table. Cities from 4 other states have called her. A university invited her to lecture to architecture students, and she stood in front of a hall full of graduate degrees, holding her spiral notebook of receipts. Someone recently asked her what she felt on that October morning when the police car pulled up in front of her house. She said she felt afraid for about 10 minutes. Then she remembered that the last time she felt that helpless, she was sitting alone at her kitchen table in the dark the day she buried her brother, and she decided she was never going to be that version of herself again. Ray still says what he said at that microphone, that his key was the first thing anyone ever gave him that could not be taken back. There are 23 of those keys on the east side of Kansas City now, and 9 more being cut. Curtis Grant never got one. His sister makes sure everybody else does. If Odessa's story got to you, subscribe to this channel. Every week we find one more ordinary person who looked at a problem everybody said was impossible and then fixed it with their own 2 hands. Somebody like that might be living on your street right now.